If you've been a part of the Star Wars fanbase for a while, odds are you've heard the term Grey Jedi thrown around before. The term has long been a menace to the Star Wars fanbase, a label that's often misdefined and sometimes thrown around rather senselessly. However, if you ask a Star Wars fan what a Grey Jedi is, most of the time they'll say that Grey Jedi are Force users that use the light side and dark side in equal measure, or that they somehow balanced the light and the dark. This concept is fairly popular among certain groups of fans, but there's one small problem with it. It's only a concept. It wasn't actually a thing. In fact, the concept of Grey Jedi takes a dump on some of the most fundamental aspects of the Force. Strap yourselves in, because in this video, we'll be discussing why Grey Jedi didn't and couldn't exist.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Now, before we get too deep into things, we should point out that there are two definitions of Grey Jedi that get thrown around and conflated. The first one is the one we mentioned earlier, which is the popular fan definition, but there's another we'd like to highlight as well. The term Grey Jedi was also used to describe adherents to the tenets of Jedi ideology who just didn't obey the Council and were considered renegades of some sort. That kind of Grey Jedi did actually exist, but it was nothing like the fan concept, since most of those Grey Jedi were just lightsiders who took issue with Jedi bureaucracy, some of whom occasionally strayed too close to the dark side. When the phrase Grey Jedi is used in expanded universe materials, that's what it means. We won't be using that definition going forward because that's not the concept we're talking about. The fan concept of Grey Jedi often goes hand in hand with another misconception, that balance in the Force, the ideal state of being in the Star Wars universe, meant balance between the light side and the dark side. These Grey Jedi then would be the ideal Force users, the protectors of this balance. This perspective sees the light and dark as two sides of the same coin, with too much of either being a bad thing for the galaxy. Let's start with this last idea, about balancing the light and the dark. That's actually a false dichotomy based on an oversimplified view of the light and dark side. It assumes the two sides of the Force were sort of like a yin and yang, opposed yet complementary, with the balance in the Force equating to a balanced yin-yang. In reality, the light side was the balanced yin-yang and the dark side was the state of unbalance. To explain this, let's go back to the basics for a brief moment. The Force was a sort of energy web that interconnected all life and indeed all matter in the universe on a certain level. It didn't just interconnect living beings though, it guided them too. The Force had a will, a sort of collective consciousness into which living beings merged after death. The will of the Force sent messages through this web of life, guiding sentient life toward the greater good. By tapping into this web, Force sensitives could exploit the interconnected state of the universe to pull off all manner of superhuman feats. Lightsiders tapped into the Force by opening themselves up to it. Through strict discipline that took years to fully develop, they would purge themselves of all individual motivations and let the will of the Force guide their actions. In a sense, Lightsiders didn't actually use the Force at all, they let the Force use them. Practicing the light side of the Force was entirely selfless in nature, as it involved surrendering one's entire being to the will of the Force. Since the will of the Force was the collective consciousness of all life in the universe, it knew better than any individual what was best for the galaxy, so Lightsiders pretty much just let it use them to its own end. This was the natural way to interact with the Force. The stronger the light side, the more influential the will of the Force was, which allowed life to thrive and balance to be maintained. Darksiders, on the other hand, imposed their own will over the will of the Force. They made the Force do what they wanted, regardless of what the will of the Force desired. To bend the Force in this way, Darksiders relied on strong, selfish, and usually aggressive emotions to strengthen their own wills, greater degrees of dominance over the Force. This was done in defiance of the will of the Force, and was always actively harmful to life in the galaxy, even if only in small ways. The use of the dark side was entirely unnatural and had a corrupting influence on life, which is why long-term users of the dark side ended up with wrinkly scrotum faces. This was because the will of the Force granted clarity, direction, and balance to life, while using the dark side actively suppressed it. Balance in the Force was not balance between the light side and the dark side. It was actually the supremacy of the light and the eradication of the dark, as this allowed life to thrive under the direction of the will of the Force. On top of that, however, it was impossible to actively balance the light and the dark. This is for one simple reason: the dark side corrupted those who used it, even if they only used it a little. The dark side is best understood like a powerful narcotic. It was addictive, and the more one used it, the stronger the addiction's grip became. It took discipline and total devotion to the light side to avoid its law. Every use of the dark side, no matter how small, was dangerous in that it could easily pull the user back for more. Once a Force user got a taste of the dark side's power, it was difficult to resist. The path of the dark side promised the fulfillment of all Force users' selfish desires. Of course, the thing about selfish desires is that they're a bottomless hole, one which Darksiders were often sucked into and destroyed. There was no in-between with the Force. Force sensitives could either obey the will of the Force or impose their own will on the Force. They could either adhere to the disciplines of the light side or get sucked into the trap of the dark side. Not even the greatest Force sensitives could walk the line between the two. Trying was like walking along the edge of a sheer cliff with 1 foot over the edge. Sure, Force sensitives could give it a try, but it never ended well. Now that we've banished the idea of a grey zone in the Force, let's talk about some specific cases of so-called grey Jedi. Many of the characters often identified as grey Jedi were identified with respect to the other definition we mentioned earlier, but were stalwart lightsiders, such as Qui-Gon Jinn and Ahsoka Tano. Others were just lightsiders who had close brushes with the dark side now and again, such as Mace Windu and Quinlan Vos. There are a few unique cases with similarly simple explanations. Revan, for example, had a personality split so intense that half of him was a lightsider and the other a darksider. But there were a few cases that merit further examination. Perhaps the most important were two from Knights of the Old Republic, Jolee Bindo and Kreia. These characters are both identified as neutral according to the Force alignment scale of the games, with Jolee leaning lightly toward the light side and Kreia being dead center. Here's the thing though, that's just a game mechanic meant purely to allow light side players to have companions who can use dark side powers. If you look at the actions and values of these characters, they were anything but neutral. Jolee Bindo was a lightsider. As much as he grumbled about the Jedi and how much he disliked the concept of light and dark, he never actually did or even endorsed anything that could be even vaguely construed as a dark side act. The worst he ever did was avoiding getting involved in situations in which he probably could have done some good. That's not a balance between light and dark, that's just a lazier allegiance to the light with a few authority issues thrown in for kicks. That's not a knock against Jolee, mind you, he was still one of the coolest beings to grace the galaxy. Kreia, on the other hand, was an out-and-out darksider. Her goal of destroying the Force itself was certainly outside of the box and definitely not a teaching of either the light or the dark. That was just her personal philosophy. When she used the Force, she drew on the dark side, as she freely admitted. Furthermore, her motivation for killing the Force was her hatred for the will of the Force, and honestly, that's as dark side as you can get. Additionally, in Legends, there are a select few groups or individuals that bought into the idea that there needed to be a balance between the light and the dark. The Jedi Order, the predecessors of the Jedi, was perhaps the most prominent example of this. These groups were simply wrong, of course, and most expanded universe stories that feature such groups depict that they're wrong in one way or another. To return to the example of the Jedi, their balance between the light and the dark fell apart in the end because, as always, the dark side corrupted those who used it. The Jedi were introduced as a cautionary tale, a failed experiment that allowed their successors, the Jedi, to reach the correct conclusions about the Force and its nature. There were no grey Force users and there was no grey zone in the Force. We hope we've answered any questions you might have had about this topic, and if not, feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below.